So thank you very much indeed, Roger, for having accepted this interview, for the time and generosity. I'm really pleased to talk to you.
Glad to be part of your project.
My pleasure. So, Roger, I have a very introductory note about you and your research, and then we can start with the questions. Of course, you can add up to that if there is something missing. Roger T. Ames is a distinguished Canadian-born philosopher and translator, renowned for his extensive work in Chinese and comparative philosophy. Currently, he holds the position of Humanities Chair Professor at Peking University and is a Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Hawai. Ames has been instrumental in promoting the study of Chinese philosophy through a lens that respects its unique cultural and intellectual traditions. So among authored books, and I've listed some of them, Confucian Role Ethics, a Vocabulary, 2011, a source book in classical Confucian philosophy, 2023, Human Becomings, Theorizing Persons for Confucian Role Ethics, 2020, Living Chinese Philosophy, Sociology as First Philosophy, 2024, if I'm not wrong, and translation, actually, of Daodejing, a philosophical translation. Yeah, so just some of them randomly I chose. And so I mean, some of the questions are really invitations for you to talk and expand, to elaborate on your projects. They are not directly questions, like the first one. So I'm quoting you. You say that, for me, the study of Chinese philosophy is much more than merely academic. It's a profoundly personal and transformative quest that has been inspired by the close personal relationships I've enjoyed over the years with teachers and colleagues at Chinese universities. End of quote. I would be happy that you start talking on that.
Madi, when I was 18 years old, I was very interested in writing poetry. And so, but I was a young person without any content, without any experience. And so my passion was not focused. You've disappeared? Are you there, Madi?
Oh, yeah, I'm there. I'm there.
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah.
it was a bit, yeah. So sorry.
So, so I had this opportunity to go to Hong Kong to study for a year. And so that was the beginning of my relationship with China. When I arrived in Hong Kong, just as a person arriving in India or a person arriving in Iran, coming from North America, and I was coming from Canada, that it was a different world. The values, the personal identities, the way in which people became persons was very different from what I was used to, particularly the power of individualism within the Western culture. That Hong Kong was very much family oriented as opposed to individual oriented. And so I began, and at the same time, in that academic environment, there was a great deal of misinterpretation of the local people by other foreign students. Other foreign students would collect among themselves, would gather in their own world, and saw the Chinese students as being immature and as being unsophisticated. But I found my friendships in the Chinese students, and so at that point, I really began this project of trying to understand a very different world. And if you're philosophically inclined, the idea of unraveling a mystery is a philosophical enterprise. And so a lifetime later, with my hair gray, I continue, to try to make sense of a world that is really very different from the world that I came from.
Yeah, thank you. I I had this part from the latest piece that you kindly sent to me, Living Chinese Philosophy. I quote a part of it. You say that while at National Taiwan University, I came to a realization about the status of philosophy in the world that astounded me. For a long time now, in the world's seats of higher learning, Western philosophy, that is almost exclusively European philosophy, has constituted the mainstream curriculum worldwide. And this situation is not simply a matter of Western arrogance. There is a good deal of self colonization as well. This self understanding of professional philosophy is as true in Taipei, Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, and Delhi as it is in Boston, Oxford, Frankfurt, and Paris. So I found it really interesting, especially because you touch on two different elements that like mutually feed each other. One of them is this Western arrogance in philosophy, that is, we are the only philosophers, and also the other side is kind of self-colonization. I would be happy to hear more on that, and I continue with my question.
Sure, sure. One of the things, Muddy, that I should really underscore, and it really goes back to your first observation, and that is that in becoming interested in Chinese philosophy, it was more through my relationships with people, my classmates, my teachers, the community, than it was by reading books. You know, that philosophy resides in people. And and so my journey is very much sort of a narrative. It's a story. It's a conversation. It's a participation in a continuing dialogue. And early on, I went to Taiwan to do my coursework for the master's degree, and and at that time, philosophy was the self-understanding of philosophy was that it is Anglo-European, that the idea that other cultures, it's sort of like the European, the Eurocentrism that existed at that time. It's changed dramatically recently with this kind of move towards Asia. But at that time, it was still very, very strong. You know, civilization is European, and then other people are less so. Um, and so I was fortunate when I finished at the University of London. When I finished my PhD, I was offered a position at the University of Hawaii, and the University of Hawaii in the 1930s was directed by a man named Wingsit Chan, Chan Rongjie, and he and his colleagues wanted to to change philosophy, to make philosophy into a global enterprise, to understand philosophy in planetary terms, in global terms. And so the University of Hawaii, from the 1930s, began this project of looking at philosophy from a world perspective. My first teacher in Hong Kong, Lao Seguang, used to always say to me, Roger, 我们不要谈中国哲学，我们要谈世界哲学中的中国哲学。 That we don't want to talk about Chinese philosophy, we want to talk about Chinese philosophy within the context of world philosophy. And that's what I found at the University of Hawaii. And it wasn't that some people taught Chinese philosophy and some people taught Western philosophy. By and large, each member of the faculty was an Oxford-trained analytic philosopher, and at the same time did Indian philosophy. Somebody was an American-trained pragmatist, but then did Japanese philosophy, and so on. So that in each person, you had this kind of expanding of horizons when it came to the self-understanding of philosophy. But in Taiwan at that time, you had not only was the idea that Chinese philosophy could only be taught in China, That would be one part of it. But on the part of the Chinese scholars themselves, who had been educated in Western philosophy, they condescended to Chinese philosophy. They didn't see Chinese philosophy as being real philosophy. And so there was this kind of self-colonization. And that continues even today. There's a lot of Chinese scholars who do philosophy who really, whose boundaries are the Anglo-European tradition, as opposed to being inclusive of Japanese and South Asian and Islamic and all the rest of these different philosophical traditions. The wonderful thing about having had a career at the University of Hawaii was that I was part of a community where philosophy did not have a boundary. But we don't want to use geographical criteria to make philosophical distinctions.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Once I read that part, I really enjoyed it. That both sides have been addressed in your argument. Yet, I was thinking of, like, imagine like an Arab student of philosophy, a woman interested in philosophy, who turns exclusively to the Western canon, does not merely do that out of personal insecurity or lack of confidence in her own culture or tradition. Rather, I had the impression, she's caught within a dominant discourse that renders Western philosophy the measure of legitimacy while
Uh,
obscuring or even discrediting the richness of other or her intellectual heritage.
we, we can call it epistemic injustice. You know,
Injustice. Right.
you're absolutely right that if this person, this Arab woman, wants to be taken seriously by the dominant philosophical community, then she would have to abandon, her. She would have to abandon reference to her own tradition, about which none of her colleagues know anything, and simply speak their language. And so you have this kind of epistemic injustice.
Definitely.
But there's also a self-colonizing to it, in the sense that a person trained that way buys into the values in some degree. And it's not that their attitude towards their own tradition is that it lies outside of the boundaries in some way. Different people are different, but some of the students of Western philosophy, coming from non-Western traditions, really do condescend to their own tradition.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is quite demanding to keep that, to maintain that. I keep reading another part of that passage, that where you say that, I'm quoting you, I was a young man in search of the intensity and high adventure necessary to write poetry with life. Filled with life. At Redlands, I had been studying Western philosophy, and like innumerable students over the centuries, I was immediately inspired by the honesty of Socrates and his philosophical quest to know thyself. In Hong Kong, I was introduced to Confucian philosophy, and in contrast to, but perhaps complementary with Socrates' journey of self discovery, I became fascinated by his aesthetic project of cultivating oneself, broadening the way. Sorry, I can't pronounce the Chinese terms. That's why I'm just reading the the English version. Broadening the way and ultimately transforming the cosmos. End of quote. So, Roger, I have the impression that it seems you are taking more and more distance from this Socratic tradition.
Yeah. So, I mean, the story, like you read the titles of some of my books, and there's a journey there. The journey begins from the aspiration to take the tradition on its own terms, to allow the tradition to speak for itself, to stop um, reducing the tradition to questions and paradigms and theories that are not its own. When we look at ethics, for example, there's a debate within sinology, there's a debate within Chinese philosophy itself as to whether Chinese ethics, Confucian ethics, are deontic, Kant, are utilitarian, Mill, or are virtue ethics, Aristotle and Hume. And when you take that position, what you're doing is you're taking the encounter of Confucian philosophy with Western philosophy as its defining moment. This is where Confucian ethics begins, is when it encounters the Western philosophical tradition. And that's, you know, when we think of the relationship between these traditions, China is an old, antique culture. And Confucian ethics existed long before the encounter between China and European culture. And so my argument in that book, Confucian Role Ethics, the most important point is the subtitle is a vocabulary. A vocabulary. So the whole idea was to allow it to speak with its own language. And so what I do in that book is I used its own language to try to articulate what I call role ethics. And role ethics is a very simple idea. It begins from the fact that everything that we do in the world is in association. Nothing does anything by itself. Physically, intellectually, culturally, everything is in association. As soon as we stipulate what association is this, then it becomes normative. I'm a teacher, and so I have a relationship with a student. Am I a good teacher? Is she a good student? I'm a husband. Am I a good husband? Is she a good wife? And so on. That we live our lives in roles, and life is a drama, you know. And we live our lives in roles. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to use this way of thinking. And roles are things that we do together. They're not something that we do by ourselves. And so the idea that morality is not Kantian, you know, duty to some categorical imperative, but rather is am I behaving with Mahdi in such a way that I'm growing our relationship in a positive way? Am I communicating with him in such a way that the relationship is becoming more robust, more important, more meaningful?
Right.
And so I did that. But what I discovered is that Western scholars and Chinese scholars in important degree have this idea of individualism as a kind of default assumption. So they go back to, they read my role ethics through the idea of an individual, where Western liberalism, you know, autonomy and freedom and rationality and choice and self-interest and so on, all of this kind of vocabulary is not there in the Confucian world. And so what I had to do is in writing the book on human becomings, what I wanted to do is I wanted to set a contrast between this ontological way of thinking about individual human beings and what happens in a Confucian world, where people in their relationships with other people gradually emerge as distinctive individuals. And so individuality in the Confucian tradition is not a starting point. It's what you're able to achieve by virtue of the quality of relationships that you cultivate with other people.
Right. Absolutely. Great. Great. Yeah, absolutely. I found that as one of the pillars of your argument in the human becoming book. That I have a quote from that book that sort of confirms exactly what you said now. That I'm quoting you in this monograph. I argue that the most important contribution Confucian philosophy broadly and Confucian ethics more specifically has to make to this conversation is to provide a robust alternative to the notion of the discrete and autonomous individual at a time when the foundational individualism has become a default position in most contemporary ethical discourse. So you continue and there you, I mean, you have developed there the role ethics, as you said, and the associated view of relationality constituted persons in part because you believe it offers the best way to understand the Confucian philosophy on its own terms, rather than forcing it into existing Western philosophical categories, most commonly virtue ethics, as you said, in Anglophone scholarship. So there is no question there. It was just a confirmation and continuation of what you said. I can go forward with a little question. It's sort of, I mean, I hope I can formulate it not completely naively. I do my best. So I mean, when we face Greek philosophy, I have always this question, I mean, vis-a-vis Chinese or other traditions, that did the Greeks, I mean, or the Greek philosophers consciously choose to base their philosophy on substance metaphysics, while the Chinese focus on something different, namely relations or process relational cosmology? Or were these differences largely shaped by historical and cultural contingencies? I mean, is it not also a political issue at work? Do we see this as only direct ontological decisions?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. First, I would say that when we look at the early Greek philosophers before Parmenides, so we're looking at Heraclitus and Empedocles and so on. We're looking at the Milesian philosophers. These philosophers were hylozoistic in their thinking. That is to say, that the concept of physis, the idea of life, was fundamental to their way of thinking. That was just an unannounced assumption that life is real, change is real. And it's only with Parmenides, his intuition that only being is, that Greek philosophy goes in a certain direction. And that direction is it changes from philosophia to philoepisteme.
Mm-hmm.
It changes from the love of wisdom, which is a living way of knowing the world, to love of apodictic truth, to some kind of unconditioned truth. And so, and it's Aristotle who reinterprets the early Greek philosophers as materialists, as people who, in some way, belong to their ontological way of thinking. And where does this ontology come from? When we think of the Mediterranean, when we think of navigating deserts, navigating the ocean, we need an Archimedean point. And so mathematics becomes a very important symbol of knowledge, becomes a model of knowledge in this particular world, where 1 + 1 = 2 is a quality of truth that we want to aspire to. What if we could do politics? What if we could do ethics? What if we could do religion with the same certainty as we have when we do 1 + 1 = 2? And so the idea of mathematics, above the doorway at Plato's Academy, let no one who has not studied mathematics enter here. I mean, mathematics really becomes a model of knowledge. In the East Asian tradition, it was all about agriculture. It was all about growth. It was all about planting, almanac, the turning of the seasons, and so on. And so where being becomes, this Archimedean point, this starting point becomes so essential within the Greek world, the idea of life, the idea of growth, the idea of birth, and the life cycle becomes a fundamental value within the East Asian tradition. And so that's very much reflected in their in the narratives, the trajectory that these traditions took. And what I would really make the point, Madi, is that we're not talking about a simple contrast between Western and Chinese thinking. that within the Western philosophical narrative, I don't know the Persian narrative, but within the Western narrative, people like Vico, people like Spinoza, people like the transcendental poets, people like Machiavelli, that these were zootological thinkers. These were thinkers who began from the idea of one world. They began from the idea of, Spinoza and his idea that that nature is God. That you have that, and then with Nietzsche and the idea that God is dead, you have a zootological turn within the Western philosophical narrative, where the philosophy in the West from the end of the 19th century down to the present has been an attempt to get out of ontological thinking, out of ontotheological thinking, and to try to find our way back to wisdom, to find our way back to process, to find our way back to embracing change and open-endedness and so on, to get away from the idea of a single truth and return to the idea that philosophy ought to be an intelligent conversation.
Absolutely. I see absolutely. That's the interesting point, that you can't really reduce it to a simple contrast between two traditions. Yet another part of the book is about self. I'm quoting you. If the self is not independent, but shaped through relationships, and virtues only have meaning within these relationships, how does this change our understanding of ethics? So that's a question that you raise, and I'm asking the question here again. And what are the implications of having a relational, situated self vis-a-vis an isolated, autonomous self when it comes to ethics?
So morality, instead of being um, the application of impersonal reason, Kant, instead of being um, the sort of according with a given set of moral precepts, as we find in sort of religious traditions, the will of God, following the will of God, as it is articulated in our scriptures, instead of morality being a calculation of how many goods can be produced if we behave in this way, instead of treating morality as the cultivation of certain generic kind of virtues, morality becomes growth in relationships. That's simple. That when I comport myself in such a way that I'm growing my relationships with people around me, what I'm doing is I'm behaving morally. I'm behaving ethically. If I behave in such a way that it diminishes relationships, if I'm unkind, if I'm disrespectful, if I'm selfish, then that is immoral conduct. And so morality becomes the transformation of experience into something that is more intelligent, more productive. That's simple. So we often think of the idea of good is something that we start with. Human nature is good. And so then we become human beings and we become good. Or good is some kind of a goal that we aspire to, that we want to be good people. And
Right.
so, but good is something that happens to experience when we live experience in a way that is productive, that is
Right.
accommodating,
Right.
that gives affordances to other people.
Right. Great. There is a part of the book that you're talking about your late friend, your dear friend, if I pronounce correctly, Henry Rosamond, right? And you say that Rosamond challenges the common view that Chinese writing is merely derived from speech, arguing instead that spoken and written Chinese have distinct semantic, syntactic, and phonological features that both matter for understanding Chinese thought and culture. So he emphasizes the importance of context and meaning over strict syntax and or phonetics. Traditionally, Chinese education taught language through memorized canonical text, giving learners a shared reservoir of contextual examples for creative expression. For Rosamond, you say the Chinese worldview values the uniqueness of each situation, seeing words and people as ontologically equal, and prioritizes dynamic relations and contextual correlations over abstract ontology and epistemology, framing the cosmos as an ever-changing network of events. So my sort of point here, if not a question, is that it's not that you are, I mean, is it that you are attributing this as an essence or the nature of Chinese language or culture? Or rather, you're talking about the way that this culture has been functioning?
I would take it to be the former.
All right.
That uh, Gadamer, Humboldt, both of them make the point that when Aristotle talks about human beings, and when he associates human beings with logos, he's not making the claim that human beings are rational animals and therefore we're one thing. He's making the point that we're language animals and therefore we're part of a human conversation. And that human conversation is to be understood in terms of forming and functioning. That language, Wittgenstein, with the idea of language games, the idea that mind is not something inside our head, but minding is something that we do in the world by belonging to a conversation. And that conversation is personal. It's a conversation with nature. It's a conversation with culture. And so I wouldn't want to diminish the importance of cultural differences by asserting that we all go back to some identical point. That human beings are certainly, we have DNA. The idea of race is a fiction. The idea that that somehow we're defined essentially. The idea of human nature, for me, is a wrong way of thinking about what it means to become a human being. That we certainly do have initial beginnings, but the majesty of the human experience, the magnificence of the human experience lies in our creativity, in what we're able to do, our imagination, what we're able to achieve in the world. And so I would really want to say that thinking in different languages, you would know this better than most people, I would think. I mean, one of the things about knowing different languages is that we come to understand that Aristotle and Plato and Confucius and our different cultural heroes are not inventing a world. What they're doing is they're archaeologists mining the language and excavating perennial truths out of that language. And so, so when we look at the Chinese language, where do the Chinese characters come from? I mean, you look at Egypt, with hieroglyphics. Chinese characters begin that way. Like the starting point for the Chinese tradition, the literary tradition, is the ancestral sacrifices that were carried on in ancient China, and by the time that we get to the Shang Dynasty, which is the second millennium BC, the records that we already have 5,000 Chinese characters. For a Chinese to read a newspaper, you need 3,500 characters, or you need 2,000, 3,000 characters. Literacy in a Chinese world is 3,500 characters. And so 5,000 characters is already a robust language that is able to express, sort of aspects of the human experience in a robust way. But in Chinese, you call the Chinese character Hanzi. The zi in Hanzi means progeny, offspring. And so that 5,000 characters, if we look at the Chinese dictionary today, it's not 5,000 characters, it's 50,000. And so what has happened across the millennia is new language has been produced to broaden the horizons of the human experience within this Chinese context, and new language developed to include Buddhism in their worldview, to include Islam in their worldview, to include Western learning, different kinds of Western learning in their worldview. And so the Chinese language is really a literary genealogy. It's a narrative. It's a story of a particular people.
Right.
And so Chinese are always talking today about 中国的故事, Chinese story, the Chinese story. 要说清楚中国的故事. We have to speak the Chinese story clearly.
Wow, beautiful. I really envy it. There is a beautiful part in the book that I'm quoting you. I like this part. You say, while the meticulous scholar Nathan Sevin is adamant in exhorting us to resist either or simplicity in our cultural comparisons, at the same time, he has also observed that, you're quoting him, a man's prodigious creativity seems to be based on the permutations and recastings of a rather small stock of ideas. If such is the case, you ask, how do we then get to this rather small stock of ideas that might allow for the mapping out of their subsequent permutations and recastings? I ask these questions not only about China, but specifically about China. I mean, it can be applied to any culture. First of all, it's a very beautiful quote. This small reservoir is like Chomskyan, it's like Chomskyan root, deep structure of language, yeah? But what is interesting, I mean, it can be applied to any languages, but what was interesting for me was, isn't it harder in talking about in finding these small stock of ideas in a language like Chinese, which is very much a very a high context language,
Right. No, very nice. I would make a clear distinction between what Nathan Sivan means by a small stock of ideas and Chomsky's deep structure.
Okay, yeah, sure, please.
The person that you mentioned a moment ago, Henry Rosemont, was a student of Chomsky.
Oh, okay.
And in my collaborations with him, I was always pushing Chomsky out of our work. That Chomsky's deep structure is kind of a metaphysics of language. And I don't think we want that. Like, I think that what we're talking about is generalizations. Generalizations are very different from universals. Archetypes, universals, arche, metaphysics. That is one way of seeing the world. I wrote a paper that is called Unloading the Essentialism Charge. That one very frequent criticism of people like me who do philosophy of culture is that we're essentializing. We're neo-Orientalists, inventing the difference between cultures and making them incommensurable in some way. Not at all. But I would argue for the value of thick generalizations. We can't think without generalizations. And the idea that we can say some we can make some generalizations about Persian culture, about Chinese culture, about Greek culture, about German culture. That we have to be able to do that in order to make sense of the differences. That doesn't mean that we're setting boundaries or that we're arguing for universals. What it means is that narratives, life lived in a certain way, has established a certain value structure, a certain table of values within different cultures, where these different cultures emphasize certain things in the way in which they go about. I mean, we might talk about ends in view. We might talk about the ends of life. That different cultures, different religions aspire to a different kind of human experience, and and that's as true as saying that bumblebees fly. We know bumblebees fly. We know that Persians are different from Chinese. And so how do we go about articulating those differences?
Right. I see your point. Thank you very much for adding that. Uh, in the I have another part I quote to you. I have taken it upon myself to create the neologism zootology with Greek zoo life and logia or logia discourse as a new form for an old way of thinking that has deep roots in classical Chinese cosmology. It gives us a contrast between ontology as a science of being per se and zootology that we might translate as the art of living. I don't know the Chinese pronunciations. Shenggenlun.
相生论. Yeah.
Okay, so it takes me ages. Um, so this cosmology begins is the rest the next part of the code. You add this cosmology begins from living Sheng itself as a motive force and change, and gives us a world of boundless becomings. It gives us not things that are, but events that are happening. So because you were talking about the art of living, my point, my question, I would be happy and thankful if you elaborate on that. In Greek philosophy, the art of living was also the very aim of thought. For Plato, it meant aligning the soul with truth and justice. For the Stoics, living in harmony with reason and nature. For the Epicurus, seeking calm pleasures and freedom from fear. For the Cynics, radical simplicity. And so, despite these differences, all treated philosophy as a practical guide to shape their life wisely. So, what is the difference between that kind of art of living that you're addressing in the new book? Or are they the same, as you said, parts of perennial minings in different traditions, probably?
No, I think that those traditions are open to interpretation. I don't know if you know the work of Pierre Hadot.
Sure.
And so that's what you're alluding to in your question here. And I think that Hadot is making a very important point. And that is that much of Western philosophy, if we look at somebody like Pythagoras, who was the first person, Herodotus describes him as a philosopher. And so Pythagoras was certainly interested in abstract ideas, the triangle, you know, but he was a religious figure. He was a social reformer, political reformer. He had a following of thousands of people.
Right.
Uh, so the idea of associating him with the love of wisdom was a good association. But when you get to Hadot talks about what was going on in the academy, in the Lyceum of Aristotle, and he talks about how these kinds of rational practices, spiritual exercises, he calls them, were transforming the philosopher into something special, that the philosopher was able to ascend and become something different from other human beings by virtue of a certain kind of rational regimen, a logic, and so on. That's not what's happening. That's not the art of living in a Chinese world. In a Chinese world, the idea of the sage is the same as everybody else, except he or she does the ordinary in an extraordinary way.
Right.
And so it's not about becoming something different. It's about achieving a kind of consummation in the opportunities available to us to
Right.
be human beings.
Right.
A grandmother's love for her grandson is the most common thing that we have in the world, but it's the most beautiful thing that we have in the world, you know.
Sure.
And so the Confucian art of living is all about what we do to the life experience, the
Right.
ordinary life
Right.
experience.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. You have another, there is another part that really fascinated me. It was so beautiful. I quote you. So I have like two, three more questions and then we are done. I quote you that there is a popular proverb in modern Chinese that translates as, I cannot see the true face of Mount Lu because I am standing within this mountainscape. End of quote. You add later that while everyone uses this phrase, I think most people misunderstand it. This expression is usually read as asserting that an external, more objective perspective is better than one from the inside. As the Zhuangzi says, a father will not act as matchmaker for his son because whatever the father might say in praise of his son is not as persuasive as it would be coming from someone else. End of quote. Later on, you add a beautiful part. Perhaps I find it. It's a corrective. It's a poem, sushi poem, if I'm not wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I would be happy if you explain about it. So you say that Sushi famous verse says that horizontally I see the ridges, vertically the peaks, far or near, high or low. Each affords a different view. I cannot see the true face of Mount Lu because I am standing within this mountainscape. So I found it really very interesting and poetic, also philosophical. I would be happy to hear about it.
Yeah. I mean, in um, in the English language, European languages, the epistemic vocabulary, when we think about truth, we use language like I get it, I grasp it, I comprehend it, I understand it. It all has to do with analysis, finding something behind something that is obscuring it. And so that whole Greek idea of doxa episteme, of finding real truth behind opinion, the idea of metaphysical realism, the idea that there is a reality behind appearance. That is a kind of framework for our epistemology. In the Chinese world, the metaphor is really one of mapping. That when you talk about understanding in Chinese, you say 我知道, I know the way, or 理解, I can unravel the patterns, or 了解, I can shed light on the patterns, and so on. That it's a kind of reconnoitering, it's a kind of navigating, it's a kind of finding your way forward. And in order to do that, you have to understand the terrain. And so the terrain, that poem is all about, as I understand it, is all about how there are so many different perspectives that true understanding comes with including as many perspectives as we can, where those perspectives are really inexhaustible. We reside within the mountainscape, And so we're always looking at this mountainscape from one perspective or another. One of my signature ideas that I took from one of my early teachers, a man named Tang Juni, is in Chinese you talk about 一多不分管. You talk about the inseparability of one and many, of many is one, one many. That when we think of, and this goes to the difference between a universal and a generalization. Universals are independent. One counterexample defeats a universal. But generalizations are made better by having new knowledge. So we refine our generalizations by taking into account new instances of, and so that gives us a kind of uh, it gives us a kind of abductive reasoning if we use Peirce's language. You have induction, which is adding more information, and so that makes our pool more robust. But ultimately, Peirce wanted reasoning to be able to be productive, to make meaning, to produce new meaning, and so he introduced the notion of abduction. And so that's where we go in the Chinese concept of knowing, that when you're knowing a world, you're realizing the world. What you're doing is you're bringing into being a world that you're imagining. And so it's not the discovery of reality behind appearances, it's rather making meaning, expanding the horizon, going beyond where we are at present. And it's only by including additional perspectives that we're able to achieve that.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you. That was really helpful, especially the difference between generalization and universals. It makes it more and more clear to me what you mean. But imagine that I have booked a ticket from Greece, from from the course of Plato, and I'm going to China. So, and then in Athens, I have learned that I have to know myself. Somebody has told me, know thyself. And now I am in the presence of Confucius, and I want to know, I want to understand what he means by, if he at all acknowledges, accepts, or so asserts this idea of knowing yourself. So what happens to know thyself in this kind of Chinese understanding?
Knowing thyself in Chinese can be captured in an expression, 知己知彼，百战不殆. To know yourself and to know the other will always be successful. That the only way that you can know yourself, I'll give you an example. You know the Bible, you know the story of the Good Samaritan.
I
Do you
remember
know?
vaguely. Yeah.
Well, one of the problems I have is that that the people who introduced Confucian philosophy into the Western Academy were missionaries. And so what they did was they converted Confucianism into a form of Christianity. And so one of the more important terms in Confucian ethics is ren, which they translate as benevolence. Benevolence is the ethics of Jesus. And the Good Samaritan is the story about how one day a man is walking towards Jerusalem, and he's jumped upon by robbers. They beat him, they steal his clothes, they take his money, and they leave him bleeding in a ditch. And so a rabbi comes walking by the ditch, sees the man, and crosses the street and goes on his way. A Levite, another Jewish sect, sees the man, goes across the street, and continues on his way. Samaritan in the Jewish culture is kind of like a gypsy, is kind of like a kind of marginalized group of people, but still Jewish, but looked down upon. So the Samaritan comes, And he takes his clothes and he bathes the man, and he helps him, takes him to an inn, and says to the innkeeper, give him food, give him clothes, and here's 2 drachma. If this is not sufficient, next time I come by, I'll give you more money. And so the story is all about the right thing to do. Treat your neighbor as yourself. You know. So the last, when the lawyer asked Jesus, you know, how would you characterize this virtue? Jesus says, treat your neighbor as yourself. And it's all about pity and charity and mercy and all this stuff. It's all about altruism. It's also all about doing good to the other people. That's benevolence. I'm a benevolent God, you know. So I do good. So the what has to be done is already fixed. And so each one of these should do the same thing. That's not what Ren means in the Chinese tradition. Ren is person in the number 2. The whole idea of Ren is that if I treat Mahdi well, then it comes back on me. That what I'm doing is I'm working on a relationship that benefits Mahdi, but it benefits me at the same time. It's not doing good to somebody else. It's not treating your neighbor as yourself. It's treating your neighbor as your neighbor. Mahdi is different from Roger. When I'm trying to do what I should do with Mahdi, I have to expand my understanding. I can't assume that Mahdi has the same values that I have. I have to listen very carefully. I have to understand where he's coming from, his own life experience, his own table of values, in order to understand. And so in the Confucian world, the idea of shu is to put yourself in the place of the other person and try to understand the situation from his or her point of view. And so that's very different from the Christian benevolence. Benevolence is a good idea. Good for the Christians, you know, that they want to do good to other people, but it's kind of an arrogant posture in the sense that do unto your neighbor, treat your neighbor as yourself. You're making an assumption there that your neighbor has the same values that you have,
Right.
and that's not Confucian philosophy.
Right, right. Beautiful. And I can now translate my last question into a small digression here, following what you said. My last question was primarily about friendship. And I think that it makes a lot of sense in relation to what you already said, that it is not to be taken as a universal. I mean, as you say in a part of the book, I'm quoting you, in a Platonic world wherein meaning has a transcendent reference, friendship is instrumentalized as a commitment to a common good. I mean, you talk about different kinds of friendship, from agape to philia to eros, actually. So the question is, how then we can talk about friendship from that framework, from that Chinese framework that you are based on actually role ethics? How can we talk about friendship? So friendship does not exist in that sense, or it is more elusive, or it is more relational? How is it then?
Um, there's a passage in the Analects of Confucius where he says that I can find uh, a lesson in the company of 2 other people. That in walking with 2 other people, I learn from them what is good and what is bad, you know. And so, with Aristotle talks about a friend in virtue as being a second self, as being a mirror. So, since I should treat my neighbor as myself, since virtue is one thing, I can look over at Mahdi and I can corroborate the quality of my virtue by seeing virtue in another person. That Mahdi is virtuous in the same way that I'm virtuous, and these friends are few and far between for Aristotle. You know, a friend in virtue, and so it's based on sameness. But in the Confucian tradition, the mantra is 和而不同, is harmony, not sameness. And so what you're trying to do in the Confucian tradition is that friendship emerges out of difference. There's a passage in the Analects of Confucius that says, don't have as a friend anyone who's not better than you. And so if you're a scoundrel, then you've got lots of friends. If you're a very good person, then you have very few friends. I mean, that's what it sounds like, but that's not what Confucius means. What Confucius means is that people are good and bad in different ways. And so that in our relationships with other people, we should always be learning from them what we want to do, what we ought to do, and what we don't want to do. Some people are role models because they have a quantum of good that outweighs the bad. Some people are less so, but we can always find our way forward. And the only way we can grow ourselves is by embracing difference.
Right.
That more of the same doesn't make a good stew. It doesn't make a good dish.
Right.
That what we need is we need difference. We need to bring different things into accord.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Roger.